Hello and welcome to my review of The Picture of Dorian Gray, an 1891 novel from Oscar Wilde. The Picture of Dorian Gray had been published in a shorter form, edited without Wilde's knowledge, in a magazine the year before. Some of the scandal that followed was one of the reasons Wilde gave for reworking the text into the longer format that I have here. This story is about a young man, the Dorian Gray of the title, who is about to come of age and is considered by all to be charming and handsome. This is especially true of a painter by the name of Basil Hallward. Basil really likes Dorian. He likes him enough to cause some of that Victorian scandal, but this version of the text is a little tamer than the original and unlikely to provoke the same reaction. Hallward is a struggling artist, unable to achieve former greatness until he finds a new muse in Dorian. Basil's friend Lord Henry Wotton is keeping him company and resists his efforts to make him leave, which are clearly intended to keep him apart from Dorian. However, Basil's unsuccessful and Lord Henry watches Dorian sitting for his portrait, while generally flattering the young man and espousing his views on beauty, youth and hedonism. Dorian is prompted to wish that the picture would age instead of him. Following Henry's advice, that notably Henry doesn't much follow himself, Dorian seeks out new thrills. He finds one in Sybil Vane, an actress in a low-class theatre, and he becomes enamoured. He invites Henry and Basil to come to the theatre, describing Sybil as an actress of incredible talent. Meanwhile, Sybil's brother James is unconvinced by Dorian's romantic advances and swears revenge if his sister is hurt. However, Sybil has, in contrast to Basil, lost her muse after meeting Dorian. How can she act as if she's in love when experiencing it for herself is so very different? Her performance observed by the three men is dismissed as terrible. The audience turn on her, but she doesn't care, so in love with Dorian is she. However, Dorian himself is embarrassed by her performance and her reasoning for it, and is moved to reject her. Returning home, he notices the portrait is slightly changed. There's now a distinct and cruel sneer on his painted face. He covers the picture but decides to reconcile with Sybil, not knowing that she has killed herself until Lord Henry arrives with the news. But Henry's concern is not to mourn, but to protect Dorian from being involved in any scandal. Then, influenced by a book given to him by Henry, Dorian follows that novel's protagonist and indulges in every vice that he can. Rumours about his lifestyle lead him to be ostracised in certain circles and worshipped in others. As the picture shows more and more terribly how corrupted Dorian's soul is becoming, he locks it away in his attic and continues his wild life unchecked. Basil Hallward, about to leave for Paris, visits Dorian to find out the truth. Dorian does not deny any of the rumours, and in a slightly contrived spat, he insists that Basil see the portrait for himself. Basil can barely recognise Dorian in it, or the picture as his own work. So he insists that Dorian needs to immediately change his ways and ask God for forgiveness. Dorian blames Basil for everything and then stabs him to death. He then blackmails one of the men rumoured to be in his circle but who is now actually avoiding Dorian into disposing of the body. Dorian then goes to a dingy opium den where he's recognised and followed by James Vane. Even though some 18 years have passed, James is still determined to have his revenge. However, Dorian clearly looks too young to have been the man who romanced Sybil, so he convinces James he has the wrong man and escapes. However, one of the working girls in the area confirms to James that Dorian is the man he's looking for and that she has known him for 18 years when he hasn't aged a day in that time. Dorian attends some parties and arranges to go on a hunt. One of his friends accidentally shoots James, who is waiting in ambush. This accident prompts Dorian to change his ways, and he deliberately breaks off a romance with a local girl in order to not upset her. Lord Henry, though, is unconvinced, explaining that Dorian's change in behaviour stems from vanity. He did it because he can, not because it was right. Dorian hears Valen Campbell's suicide and decides to look again at his portrait. Angered by his continuing corruption, he stabs at it with the same knife he used to kill Basil. Alerted by a cry, the police arrive, but inside Dorian's attic they find only a dead old man and a portrait of Dorian that is beautiful again. The fame of Wilde and Dorian Gray go well beyond the pages of this novel. In fact, this may be up there with A Christmas Carol in that far more people are familiar with the story and its concepts than have ever actually read it. That does lead to the question of whether the novel can actually live up to the expectations that fame has caused it. Add to that the infamy of the author. Dickens was known as a writer. Whatever else he did, his writing was what gave him that platform and opportunity. Wilde, on the other hand, was known for a wide range of activities as a playwright, poet, and a writer of non-fiction, yes, but also as a flamboyant and outlandish member of high society, where his wit made him much in demand. His reputation would be damaged by the criminal charges he had faced for homosexuality, but that would come 5 years after the publication of Dorian Gray, and in part as a result of the original version of this book. The subtext of homosexuality around something like Lady Audley's Secret, published some 50 years earlier, may well owe a fair bit to the wishful thinking of modern scholars, but to me it seemed more overt than it does in this version of Dorian Gray, though some of that again owes something to Stoddard and Wilde's own edits and the response to the magazine edition that prompted quite a stir. But Wilde's notoriety inevitably feeds the novel. Wilde claimed that all the three male leads are him. Basil Hallward is what I think I am, Lord Henry what the world thinks of me, Dorian is what I would like to be, in other ages perhaps. Basil is certainly the moral compass, an artist struggling to keep hold of his slippery muse and feeling the pressure of living up to previous works. When he complains that he doesn't want to show his portrait of Dorian to the public because it has too much of himself in it, I think that is more of Wilde than this quote suggests. Basil is far more of a two-dimensional character than a moral ideal. Basil remarks of his struggles with fame. Some pictures of mine had made a great success at the time, at least had been chatted about in the penny newspapers, which is the 19th century standard of immortality. And in that I think that we can see Wilde's frustration, the artist's need to create something meaningful versus the fleeting trappings of fame. In this light, we can look at the appended prologue and consider the lady doth protest too much, not the last Hamlet reference in this video. I think Basil is actually the most autobiographical of the three. He represents Wilde tired of performing to others' expectation and to the expectation that he continually one-up himself. Lord Henry then might well be Wilde's own corrupted portrait, his glamour leading others astray, his own life far more shambolic than that supposed wit and image suggests. Tolerated in society for his pithy humour, Henry's supposed wisdom is actually ignored by all, including himself. It's interesting that although he is the catalyst for Dorian Gray's moral collapse, it is actually the yellow-bound novel he lends Dorian that becomes the guidance Dorian follows, ultimately to his doom. As the century neared its end, this book coming out in 1890, as I mentioned, there was considerable discussion around the idea of degeneration. People argued that the British Empire, perhaps mankind itself, had peaked and could only degenerate from this point. Nordau's famous book on the subject was published 2 years behind Dorian Gray and reflects the conversation of the time. The decay was linked to the waning influence of Christianity over the morals of people, new technology, and the changing roles of men and women. Dracula, which explored all three, was again just 7 years away, but you have in the public and private spheres a fear of what the new century would bring. Amidst all this noise, the portrait of Dorian Gray makes sense. The man degenerates while externally everything looks serene. Dorian's outward appearance protects him from his critics because they simply cannot believe that something so ideal could actually be evil. No doubt modern scholars could consider some sort of anti-empire message to be conveyed there, but I don't think it goes that far. Wilde lived among the heights of British society and abroad, welcomed and feted in salons wherever he travelled. He moved amongst the thinkers, philosophers and writers of that age that promised much, yet achieved little. He would have had first-hand experience of those like Lord Henry who talk the talk without ever walking the walk. This is what Henry himself says of those very people. They feed the hungry and clothe the beggar, but their own souls starved. In part, this is because their good deeds stem from external forces, the expectations of others, and not because it's what they actually want to do. The good deed, like Dorian's later, becomes performative rather than moral. And I think that is the degeneration that Dorian Gray is really about, not an empire-wide moral collapse, so much as the true reflection of the faux morality of the salon being replicated in the painting of Dorian. We see this when Lord Henry again says, "The terror of society, which is the basis of morals, the terror of God, which is the secret of religion, these are the two things that govern us." But the judgment of the society that Wilde moved in is seen to be shallow, easily swayed, and by the most superficial of reasons. This is enough for Lord Henry to invalidate it, persuading Dorian to seek his own judgment. But Dorian, part of the same body, can only be superficial himself, yet he is terrorised by the judgment of God, who responds to and grants his prayer that the portrait will reflect his true nature while his own image remains unblemished. The portrait haunts Dorian even after it is covered and locked away. That he is still welcomed into a disbelieving society can be seen as analogous for the fading influence of God among them. They have bought their own terror, their own morality, and rejected the latter. Dorian, like Wilde himself, is written as a polarising figure in society. Because of the rumours around him, there are just as many people rushing to him as there are leaving a room when he enters. He is blamed for the corruption of others by those around him, few of which are any better. Yet the picture, God, judges only him. The novel feels like it was written by a man under pressures, external and internal, and not enjoying it. Much like Dorian seeks experiences to have experienced them, not to have enjoyed them. Despite the protestations of the prologue that sometimes art is just art for art's sake, the picture of Dorian Gray clearly has something to say, and it is peculiar to see somebody with Wilde's reputation offering a morality tale, especially one with such an obvious religious streak. The prologue then takes on the air of Shakespeare's Henry V. Enjoy this, it's the best we can do, and please don't judge us too harshly. But contemporary critics did judge, and harshly, especially for its promotion of hedonism, lack of morality, and as a degenerating influence. Further notoriety would be heaped on the text when it was used as evidence in Wilde's trial, none of which makes too much sense when the novel has such a clear moral. Dorian enjoys little of his life. He's consumed by guilt and fear and ultimately meets a pretty grisly fate, a very curious way of promoting that lifestyle. The biggest problem with the text is living up to expectations. It simply can't do that. Wilde's fame is too great, the novel's concept too has reached so far beyond the page that millions more will know it and its moral than will ever read it. The prose, surprisingly for so witty a man, occasionally lacks subtlety, even allowing for the fact 100 years and more have passed since it was written. Dorian sees the changes in the picture and immediately blurts out what is happening rather than come to any gradual realisation. In fact, Victorian censorship was such that in this edition it isn't even clear what Dorian has done that was so bad it would doom him forever. His part in the death of Sybil Vane, remember, only gives his picture a sneer, yet the picture itself shows a quite hideous monster when Basil looks on it much later. An exclamation of horror broke from the painter's lips as he saw in the dim light the hideous face on the canvas grinning at him. There was something in the expression that filled him with disgust and loathing. So clearly Dorian has done something far worse than just be complicit in the death of an innocent woman. But what? Well, the book is as short as it is because it barely has a second act. Chapter 11 is essentially the bridge between Acts 1 and 3, but is scarcely more than 13 pages long, and it limits the horrors of Dorian's degeneracy to short-lived fascinations with literature, Roman Catholicism, music, jewels, tapestry, and a few others. The problem is that chapter 11 is also quite boring, reading a lot like a variety of lists. It makes the return to normal service very welcome. Nor does Wilde's later addition of James Vane to the narrative bring quite as much drama as it might. Laertes at least got to duel with Hamlet. James is killed by accident just when the novel's tension is rising. Likewise, Sybil Vane would have taken on more of the Ophelia role if Dorian had married her, or at least lived in sin with her and then carried on his other activities to the extent that she was treated so poorly as to be driven to suicide. It's surprising that a novel this short can feel so long in places, while also feeling rushed in others. The upside to the Picture of Dorian Gray is that Wilde is inescapably brilliant. The opening paragraph where the laburnum's tremulous branches seemed hardly able to bear the burden of a beauty so flame-like isn't just a really nice turn of phrase, it's a wonderful piece of foreshadowing. There are so many lines that raise a chuckle or an eyebrow, and others that ought to just be printed on t-shirts, because I think that it would annoy Wilde himself to see something so tawdry, or perhaps if he truly believes all art has no value, then maybe he had approved. Here are 3 of my favourites. He had set himself to the serious study of that great aristocratic art of doing absolutely nothing. Like all people who try to exhaust a subject, he exhausted his listeners. To get back one's youth, one only has to repeat one's follies. In conclusion, Wilde is magnificent. The concept at the heart of Dorian Gray is, like Basil's painting, a masterpiece. Sadly, the execution of that concept is far from perfect, but Lord Henry, in his less verbose moments, is entertaining as a more insidious tempter than that met by Faust. In the more self-indulgent passages, he tempts the reader towards speed reading, but overall, he just succeeds. Dorian's origins as a wide-eyed innocent soon transition to aristocratic disinterest in the harm his actions cause, but it makes for an interesting dichotomy, and if Act 2 were better executed, then it would be even more fascinating. Though laboured in places, the Picture of Dorian Gray is elevated by Wilde's turn of phrase, cynicism, pithy wit, and just a little bit more. Where it stands in history and the themes it deals with add another layer of interest. Ultimately, though, it is not quite the sum of its parts. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, liking and subscribing is the way to show it. And if you do that and ring the bell, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.